chilling tales for dark nights.
What I Saw Beneath the Riptide. Written by Elias Witherow. Performed by Atticus Jackson and Otis Jiry. I reclined in my chair, enjoying the hot sun on my face. The waves before me crashed with rhythmic purpose, and I felt myself growing sleepy. Seagulls cawed overhead. The scent of salt and suntan lotion filled the air. Life was good. I sat up, rubbing my eyes in the afternoon heat, and dug my toes into the sand. I watched as a father helped his little boy build a sandcastle. I smiled. What a good dad. I took my sunglasses off my head and slid them onto my face, stood and stretched. I loved the beach. It was impossible to be worried about anything here. I had come here for the weekend, my little oceanfront cottage standing discreetly behind me. I had purchased it a year ago, my recent business ventures allowing me some of life's finer luxuries. If only I had someone to share it with. Perhaps later in the evening I'd chance a trip to the local bars and see if I could round up some company. Not that I minded the isolation. After all, it was hard to feel lonely when surrounded by such beauty. I rubbed the back of my neck. My fingers came away coated in sweat. It was time for a dip. I tossed my sunglasses onto my beach chair and slowly approached the water's edge. Frothing residue lapped at my feet, followed by the dying remains of a small wave. I sighed. It felt amazing. Smiling, I charged the rolling mass of sparkling ocean. As the water splashed around my waist, I took a deep breath and dove under. I came up gasping, wiping my eyes, skin glistening in the sunlight. I waved to a group of girls who were body surfing to my left and dove again. The green water peaked and sloshed around me as I paddled further out, enjoying the exercise. I felt the sleepiness drain from my body as my muscles warmed. I flipped over and switched to a backstroke, closing my eyes against the brilliance of the burning sun as I swam further out to sea. Eventually, I slowed my pace and floated on the surface, letting the tide rock me in its arms. My ears filled and emptied with water, and I listened to both worlds, one above and one below. The ocean had always filled me with a sense of wonderment. We were one, yet separate, two sides of the same coin. After some time, I lifted my head from the water and shook the clinging, sparkling droplets from my hair. I blinked against the salt stinging my eyes and realized that I was a lot further out than I thought. The shore was a deceptive stretch of cool brown sand that remained an uncomfortable distance away. I realized I couldn't touch the bottom. I dove under, trying to gauge how deep the water was, and when I surfaced, I felt my heart begin to race. I was entirely too far out. I forced myself to remain calm and started to swim towards shore. There weren't many people in the water. I didn't think anyone could even see me at such a distance. I focused on my strokes, keeping my head down and my arms moving. My muscles began to burn and I chanced to look towards shore. It appeared as if it hadn't moved at all. Swallowing hard, I dove and began to pull myself through the swirling green. I mustered what strength I had, kicked my legs, and thrust myself towards land as effectively as I could. When my lungs began to ache, I reached for the surface and came up sputtering. Again, it appeared as if I hadn't swam at all. And that's when I felt the pull around my legs. I was in a riptide. A nasty one. My body felt drained and the beach remained impossibly far away. A nest of worms wriggled in my stomach and my breathing became frantic. I tried to fight off the panic. It was like trying to stop an avalanche. I desperately tried to recall what I was supposed to do in a situation like this. I didn't want to scream for help for fear of tiring myself out to the point of exhaustion. Something about swimming parallel to the shore came to mind. Taking a deep breath, I dove to my left. With each stroke, I felt my body get heavier. Soon, my arms felt like slabs of stone and my legs like cement anchors. Then, I went under. Terror worked against me, filling my limbs with fire. I tried to pull myself to the surface, but only managed a mouthful of salty ocean. I gagged and spun underwater, my lungs pounding against my chest, my heartbeat a frenzied cry in my ears. I managed to find the surface again, but it drained what little adrenaline I still had. I sucked down one gasp of air before I went under. My limbs were useless, completely spent. Soon my head began to ache from a lack of oxygen, and I snapped my eyes open in horror, searching for the surface. A terrible claustrophobia set in as a dark green haze filled my vision, pressing in around me. I felt the riptide pull me back into its merciless jaws. My chest howled for air, but the water held me with wet chains. My body sank deeper and deeper, writhing in agony, and I felt myself begin to fade. With increasingly bleary eyes, I searched for a savior. Finding none, the black rushed in on me. Then I noticed something stretched out below me, a mass of sparking color, like a storm cloud filled with flashing neon electricity, or the broken remnants of some natural phenomenon. Right as my feet were about to enter the mass, I passed out. I woke to the feeling of something cold on my face, moving darkness, a voice. I focused on the voice, pulling my consciousness towards it with all my willpower. The black began to fade. Light. Color. The world swam in an explosion of blurry motion. Then I blinked. I sat up gasping, eyes popping open. Sweat poured from my face and I scrubbed it from my eyes. Where was I? What had happened? I looked around and I saw I was in some kind of hut.
Hey, take it easy. It's okay.
I spun around to face whoever was speaking to me. My heart clawed up my throat and I stumbled off the cot I had been resting on, horror ripping across my mind. A naked man sat before me, but he was mutated. The skin beneath his eyes drooped down his cheeks, exposing angry red muscle that oozed with gelatinous slime. His nose hung from his face, dangling like the trunk of an elephant. He was bald, and the top of his head was slit open. I watched in terrified disgust as a second tongue extended from the opening and licked moisture across his scalp. Drool dripped down around his ears in thick trails. Oh, God! What is going on? Where am I? I screamed, backing myself into a corner, wood and straw poking at me from the wall. The man stood up, his nose swaying like a piece of melted taffy.
It's all right. It's okay. You're safe. You made it. You're here.
I stared up at him with wide eyes. What are you? Where am I? The man put aside a wet cloth he had been using to wipe my face. He held up his hands and approached me. Squatting before me, a smile appeared on his lips.
I'm Luval. I was the one that found you on the beach. I'm so happy you are here. We've been praying for this moment for...
His eyes rolled in wonderment.
Oh, we've prayed for so long.
I held up my hand, stopping him, grimacing as the second tongue slurped across his head. The drool leaked down into his face and dripped slowly across the exposed muscle beneath his eyes. You need to tell me what's going on, I said, trying to collect myself. The last thing I remember was drowning. I got caught in a riptide and something weird in the water. Louvol smiled.
I can't even imagine what you're going through right now. But the important thing is that you're here. You've passed through the red cloud. You've done what none have done before. It's not much, a mere pinprick in its mass, but you can show us how to do it. You can show us how to get through.
I was shaking my head slowly, mouth open. Stop, please. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know anything about this. I was just taking a swim in the ocean and got pulled under by a riptide. My mind was spinning with bewilderment. What was this person talking about? The red cloud? Tearing a hole through it? I wasn't following, and the constant twist of unease in my gut wasn't helping. Louvol nodded understandingly.
It's only natural. You're a little scrambled. I can't fathom what the red cloud did to you as you passed. The suffering you must have endured. It really is a testament to who you are, to what you've come here to do.
I licked my lips, head aching as I tried to comprehend what was going on. Who I am? To my horror, Louvol reached out and stroked my face.
Why, you're an angel come to save us. You're here to show us the way to heaven. You've broken the barrier and passed through the red cloud. Now you will lead us back with you.
I blinked, confusion blasting through my mind like a cannonball. I tried to sort my thoughts, tried to piece together what had happened to me. Everything felt wrong. Everything felt different. My head ached and I clutched my temples in an attempt to focus. I had been swimming, then the riptide. Sinking down into that darkness, sinking down into that strange cloud of light. Had that been real? Or had I imagined it, my dying mind conjuring up some strange hallucination? Suddenly, Louvol reached out a hand.
Come, the others will want to meet you. You're going to be their savior, after all.
He pulled me to my feet. I couldn't make sense of any of this. What was happening to me? Awareness settled in around me as I stood, and I realized we were in a windowless hut made of straw and wood. The sand beneath my feet rose to swallow my ankles. I deduced we must still be on the beach. But what beach? Who was this disgusting man before me? Who were the others? What did they expect of me?
I can see you're having a hard time remembering. Come, let us go outside. Maybe once you see it will help restore your memory.
Reeling and uneasy, I let him lead me through the door. Sunlight erupted across my vision and I winced, shielding my eyes with my hand. I squinted, allowing the world to settle. I froze. Louvol stopped before me and turned, his second tongue rolling across his bald head, and smiled.
Behold your flock,
he said, spreading his arms. I was standing on a dune above a beach filled with people who looked just like Louvol. They stared at me in awe. 1,000 naked bodies, all with drooping noses and slits in their heads. Tongues rolled in and out of their skulls, creating a constant squirting sound that echoed across the expanse of sand. Slowly, in unison, they fell to their knees and bowed their heads in silence. My eyes grew wide, my heart thundering in my chest. What is going on? I muttered in shock. And that's when I saw something in the sky, beyond the congregation, hanging over the ocean. A long black chain extended from the heavens, hanging 200 or 300 feet from shore, over the water. At the end of the chain was the motionless, charred body of a man. He was huge, at least 9 or 10 feet tall. The chain was wrapped around his neck, and his dark, crusted head rested on his shoulders in complete stillness. My eyes traced the length of the chain into the sky to where it disappeared, its origin concealed by clouds. Where am I? I whispered, my stomach squirming as new fear surged in my gut. Louvel stepped towards me.
You're here with us. Don't you remember? We've prayed for you to come, begged God to send an angel to lead us to him. And now you have. You've emerged from the red cloud, broken through its dark walls, and come to lead us to heaven.
No, I whispered. No, that's not true. I don't know anything about this place. I'm not an angel. I'm just a person. Louvel pointed at my face.
You're wrong. Don't you know how beautiful you look? Your skin, your eyes, your hair.
He placed his hand over his naked chest.
When I found you on the beach, I nearly fainted. You're the most beautiful angel we could have dreamed of. You're perfect.
I swallowed hard and took a step back. Stop talking like that. I'm not an angel. I'm just a normal person. Louvel frowned.
Please, don't speak like that. You've just been affected by the red cloud. It will fade. You'll remember who you are.
I pointed towards the massive charred man in the sky. If I'm an angel, then who is that? Louvel turned and I could see him visibly tense.
That's the hanged man. He's what you've come to deliver us from.
I shook my head. What is he?
He watches over the red cloud beneath the water. He is our warden, our oppressor. He is the gatekeeper. If anyone tries to break through, he will stop them.
Louvel looked at me, and his sagging eyes grew dark.
He is the shadow of God, the darkness that grew behind the light of the Lord. He is the evil incarnate.
My breath caught in my throat, and I sputtered. It was too much to digest. I couldn't wrap my mind around any of it. I just wanted to get out of there, away from the nightmare and back to my beach house. The strange mass of people kneeling before me, the red cloud, the hanged man. I felt myself descending into madness. All constructs of reason and understanding crumbled before me. Please, I just want to go home. I don't belong here. This isn't right. Please. Louvel's eyes hardened suddenly.
You need to stop talking like that. You came here to save us. You came here to lead us through the red cloud to heaven. You're going to take us back with you. We've waited and prayed for this day for an eternity. You can't turn your back on us. You're the only one who's managed to make it through past the hangman. You have to show us the way.
No, I cried, suddenly overcome with a wave of dizziness. No, I'm not the one you've been praying for. Please. I put my hand to my head. The heat from the sun was splitting my mind in two. I blinked and began to see patches of darkness. I stumbled backwards, blinking sluggishly. I'm not your angel, I repeated. Then I blacked out. I snapped awake in a rush of heat and immediately sat up. My mind swirled between worlds. My face felt damp, my throat dry and parched. Sweat dripped from my nose. I pulled a hand across my eyes and blinked. Louvel was seated beside me, his long nose hanging from his face like an infected skin tag, his second tongue slowly coating his scalp with saliva. As I raised my eyes, I saw there were others in the hut. They stood by the door, watching me, mucus oozing from their eyes down their flaccid cheeks.
Hot today, isn't it? Are you feeling okay? You fainted on us.
I shifted on my bedding and warily eyed the awestruck rabble standing near the door. My stomach turned as I watched drool leak down their skin across their exposed bodies. The tongues squirming from their heads looked like bloated worms. I tasted bile on my tongue.
They want to hear you speak,
Louvel said quietly, placing a hand on my thigh.
They want to know what to do.
I jerked away from his touch and shook my head. I told you I'm not an angel. I don't know what this place is or how I got here. I can't help you. I'm sorry. As I spoke, Louvel's eyes menacing, he reached out and grasped my thigh again, his grip now firm and commanding. He spoke with cold authority.
It's time you fulfilled your duty. We don't want to hear any more excuses. Show us how to get past the hangman. Show us how to get to heaven.
He stood and motioned for me to do the same.
Come, let's go outside.
I rose with him, not sure what else to do. We approached the door and the others stepped aside to let us pass, bowing their heads slightly. No matter what I said, it seemed they were convinced I was some kind of angel. We went outside and I stopped dead in my tracks. Louvel stood beside me. The congregation was lying down on the beach, hands at their sides, like rows of forgotten corpses. When they saw me emerge from the hut, they stirred to life, crawling to their knees. There they remained, hands resting on their bare thighs. Then they waited. Behind them, the hanged man dangled motionless over the open sea.
Come, you must speak to them,
Louvel said, placing a hand on my shoulder. No, I whispered, feeling uneasy. No, you don't understand. I can't help these people. Louvel's grip turned to iron, pushing me toward the dunes.
Come, it's time you showed us the way.
I stumbled forward, my bare feet burning in the sand. The sun blazed down from a cloudless sky, and I saw thousands of hopeful, desperate eyes follow me as I walked. I watched them below me, the beach alive with movement as their tongues slithered across their bald heads, relieving them of the effects of the sun's burning light. I looked past them, towards the hanged man, squinting to catch any sign of movement. Yet he remained immobile. His eyes remained closed, and I had yet to see him take a breath. As far as I could tell, he was dead. Maybe there was something to that. Perhaps it was the answer to my problems. How long had it been since these people attempted to pass through the red cloud? How long had it been since the hanged man had last stirred? I continued to be led across the dunes, sweat pouring from my face. I felt like I was suffocating, my throat a dry strip of sandpaper. It was impossibly hot. I felt my skin cooking beneath the intense light and ran my tongue along my cracked lips. What did Louvel expect me to say to these people? As the burning sand danced between my toes, I was struck with a thought. When am I going to wake up? I almost laughed, but the sudden humor died in my dehydrated mouth. I looked behind me at Louvel and the modest crowd following us. They looked excited, hopeful. It made me sick. I had no plan and no idea what was happening to me. I had grown an army of followers who believed me to be some kind of savior, and who expected me to deliver some sort of sermon. I was trapped in a nightmare and I couldn't see any way out. One moment I had been drowning. The next I was standing before a congregation of strangers, all of whom expected me to reveal to them the path to salvation. What could I say that would make them understand? What could I do to show them I wasn't an angel?
This is good,
Louval said suddenly, squeezing my shoulder. We were standing at the peak of a large dune, a platform to spread my voice to the horde waiting below. I felt my stomach shudder as I looked out on the thousands of people on their knees looking up at me and the ever-present hanged man. I shot a look over my shoulder at Louval and swallowed hard. What do you expect me to say? I gasped. Louval spread his hands.
Anything you want. Tell us how you got here. Tell us how to follow you back to heaven. Tell us how to get by the hanged man.
My back was slick with sweat. I wiped a coat of it off my forehead and turned back to the audience below. My heart thundered in my chest. My sour breath wafted across my tongue. What should I say? How would I get them to understand? Questions rolled across my mind to the point of hysteria. I fumbled for words to say, but they died on my tongue. I could feel myself growing fearful, then frustrated, and finally, rebellious. Forget it, I thought. Forget this insanity. I cleared my throat. I'm not your angel, I yelled, my voice carrying down to them. I don't know how I got here, but I can assure you it wasn't because of your prayers. I heard Louval and the others behind me audibly gasp. I continued. I don't know where I am, or who you freaks are, but I am not your savior. I got caught in a riptide and sank into a cloudy light in the ocean. I thought I was dead. Maybe I am dead. I heard Louval growling behind me, but I ignored him. I'd had enough. The combined effect of the sand and the heat, and Louval's continued insistence that I was some angel sent there to deliver his people, had pushed me over the edge. Angrily, I clenched my fists by my sides. Sweat dripped from the tip of my nose. I don't know how to save you. I don't know how to get to heaven. I'm not the one you've been waiting for. I pointed across the ocean. And that thing? Your almighty hanged man? He looks dead. Yet here you are, cowering on the beach, trembling in fear. You want to make something of yourselves? You want to transcend to a better life? Well, stop being such cowards and do it. Louval reached out to grab me, but I shook him off, pointing towards the water. Stop waiting for a miracle and do it yourselves. I'm not your angel. Suddenly, I was cast to the ground, pulled down by strong hands. A chorus of angry voices surrounded me. Onlookers kicked sand into my face and pinned my arms to the ground. Furious and frightened, I lashed out, losing myself in the waking nightmare. Then a foot plowed into my stomach and my will to fight left me, along with most of my breath. I lay there gasping, blinking against the sun. A shadow fell over my face and Louval stared down at me with fire in his eyes.
What have you done?
He snarled. No one can save you, you helpless freaks. I spat, wriggling against my captors to no avail. Louval shook his head at me and then stared into the eyes of the others. They nodded to him, a silent conversation passing through the air above me. Get off of me! Let me go! Louval leaned down and placed his lips to my ear.
If you won't help us, then we'll find another use for you.
I stopped struggling and turned to look into his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Louvel licked his lips.
"If you won't show us mercy, perhaps the hanged man will. Perhaps an offering will change his mind. Perhaps an angel is the price we must pay to cross to the other side."
"Let go of me! You're all insane! You don't know what you're talking about!" Louvel raised a hand to the others.
"Get the boat. It's time we float to eternity, my brothers."
A cry of joy went up, followed by an even louder exclamation from below us on the beach. I cocked my head up in the sand and saw the mass of people standing, smiles on their faces. They pumped their fists into the air and began to chant. My blood went cold as I listened. Before I could speak, I was roughly hauled to my feet, hands slapping and gripping me. A hard shove to the middle of my back sent me sprawling, face first down the slope. I coughed and spat as millions of burning shards scraped across my cheeks as I tumbled end over end before sliding to a stop on the beach. Immediately, the masses were upon me. A hand tangled in my hair and pulled me to my feet while others grabbed me and began dragging me to the water's edge. I screamed and fought, panic rising in my throat like a burning volcano. Over my shoulder, I saw Louvel striding towards me down the dune, a sick smile on his face. I was filled with terror at how quickly they had turned on me. 1,000 wriggling, moving bodies surrounded me. The more I struggled, the rougher the crowd became. I coughed and wheezed as fists pummeled my body. Nails raked across my skin. Blood and slime spattered my face. Flesh pressed against me and my ears filled with the roar of the growing riot. Tripping and stumbling, I succumbed to the onslaught and fell to my knees. I felt a rope slide around my neck. Moments later, a circle of fire ignited around my throat as the crowd began dragging me towards the ocean. Blinking through blood, I trained my eyes ahead of me towards the sky, and my heart stopped in my chest. The hanged man's eyes were wide open. He was looking right at me. Dread coursed through me with the force of a raging hurricane, and I began to scream in absolute horror. The hanged man's eyes were huge and swollen, his irises 2 red orbs in a pool of blinding snow. Twin red funnels shot from his sockets like searchlights, filling my line of sight and summoning my darkest nightmares. I tried to scream, but my cries were interrupted by a jerk on the rope. The earth beneath me thundered with the stampede of feet and a hurried rush to the water's edge. I retched and felt my eyes bulge. My oxygen-starved mind began to dim. Mercifully, the rope was removed and I was dragged to my feet. My world swam as I tried to focus on the bouncing, swirling ocean of people before me. Their long noses swayed on their faces like pendulums, and their second tongues coated their scalps excitedly. A great cry sounded to my left. Weakly, I turned my head and witnessed a small craft being pushed into the water. A flat construction of wood, with a single mast that unfolded to reveal a great sail. My arms were pulled behind my back and my hands were bound. I gripped my teeth as rope cut into my wrists and I was yanked towards the boat. I coughed and fought to stay upright as my feet splashed into the water. Louvel climbed onto the craft along with 3 others. He reached down and pulled me up, then tossed me aside like a sack of dead meat. He turned to the mass of people on the beach, raising his voice.
"Pray for us. Pray for mercy. Pray for salvation."
A roar went up at our backs as we were pushed out to sea. Water splashed over the crudely constructed frame. I gagged as sea salt rushed up my nose. I was pulled into a sitting position and shoved against the mast. Through the wet hair covering my face, I looked out into the sky. The hanged man had raised his head from his shoulders and was watching our approach. The red light that shot from his eyes blinded me, and I turned away, spots dancing across my vision. My battered, shaken body offered no comfort, and fear consumed me.
It didn't have to be like this,
Louvel said behind me as he plunged an oar into the ocean. The others followed his example, their dripping faces watching me. "You've all lost your minds," I spat. The water sloshed across the wooden planks as we continued to draw closer and closer to the hanged man. All the while he gazed upon us, his massive body hovering above the surface of the sea, dangling from its celestial chain like bait on a hook. As we approached, Louvel raised his hand to the others and they stopped rowing. The craft slowed and I chanced to glance up, feeling a dark stirring in the back of my mind. I struggled to suppress my terror as something foreign poked around inside my head. The hanged man loomed before us, suspended a dozen feet above the calm waters, bathing our vessel in a red glow. At that very moment, a surge of haunting, morbid images flashed suddenly in my mind. Louvel got down on his knees, followed by the others. His voice shook as he spoke.
"Please, we come in peace. Spare us a moment and listen to what I have to say."
The hanged man remained a statue of dark fear. Louvel continued, visibly shaken.
"In exchange for passage into heaven, we offer you this angel who's come to us promising salvation."
I whipped my head to stare at him. Louvel shot me a look and pressed on.
"He's offered to rid us of your presence, but we knew there would be no passage unless you deemed us worthy. So instead of following this angel in a revolution against you, we offer him up to you as a token of goodwill, as a token of respect, as a rite of passage. Please, take him as payment and let us pass through the red cloud into heaven."
He bowed his head and spread his arms, waiting. "You liar!" I snarled.
"Silence!"
Louvel hissed. The air filled with mounting tension as the seconds ticked by. The sound of the water sloshing around the boat seemed to consume me. I shut my eyes and focused on it, shaking, trembling. The red light washed over my skin. Suddenly, I heard a collective gasp and I snapped my eyes open. In the water below us, there appeared a massive, voluminous cloud of sparking red light. It extended out into the ocean like a titanic patch of fog, a swirling dance of color churning beneath the surface. Louvel stood, eyes wide.
He is allowing us passage."
The others stood staring at one another, mouths open in complete shock. Immediately, the populace sank back to their knees and bowed their heads, sputtering their thanks and praise to the hanged man. They prostrated themselves on the boat, gushing with wonderment and promise. Suddenly, Louvel grabbed me and pulled me to my feet. "I hope you burn for this," I growled as he pulled me over to the mast.
"Quite the contrary,"
he said, yanking on me. Louvel motioned for the others to help him, and the familiar coil of rope again encircled my throat. I coughed and struggled, but was silenced with an oar to the stomach. I vomited, the bile spilling out over the deck. I craned my head to look behind me, and saw they had thrown the rope over the mast. They had decided to hang me. I stared up at the hanged man, his huge, ghastly eyes boring into my skull. His blackened skin absorbed the sunlight around him as I fought helplessly against the rope tying my hands. This is it, I thought. This is the end. Louvel was suddenly behind me. He whispered softly into my ear.
"When I see God, I will tell him of your cowardice.
A sudden rage burned within me, and my body stiffened. I turned my head and with all the vitriol I could muster, shouted, "No, you won't!" I slammed the back of my head into my captor's face. Louvold dropped the rope limply to the deck and doubled over, clutching his bleeding mouth, rewarding me with an ear-splitting scream. Before he could recover, I took a step back and grabbed his dangling nose with my bound hands. Screaming defiantly, I ripped it from his face in an explosion of crimson, tearing the tube of flesh from his head like strings of melted cheese. Louvold sank to his knees, howling as blood poured from the hole in his face. The others on the boat froze, surprised and revolted by what I had just done. The rope dropped limply to the deck. I charged the side of the boat and leapt overboard, momentarily catching a glimpse of the hanging man dropping suddenly from the sky, as if someone had released an anchor. He hit the surface with a deafening splash and disappeared beneath the waves. The murky depths obscured my vision as I made contact and immediately began to sink. I wriggled like a dolphin, trying to free my hands, but it was hopeless. I trained my burning eyes on the red cloud below me. Frantically, I wriggled towards it, my lungs hammering inside my chest. Suddenly, the water was alight with shades of red. I whipped my head to my left, bubbles exploding from my mouth, and my eyes widened in terror. The hanged man was rocketing in my direction, hands outstretched, followed closely by the heavy snake-like coil of chain. His eyes filled the depths with their haunting crimson hue, illuminating his nightmarish silver-like fingers. Seized with crippling fear, I propelled myself forward, diving deeper towards the red cloud. A muffled, haunting roar of fury erupted behind me, testing my resolve. Quivering, I resisted the urges of my splintering sanity and reached for the depths towards my salvation. I had almost reached the cloud. I kicked and screamed with all the might I could muster, leaving a trail of howling bubbles in my wake. Suddenly, I was jerked backwards and I felt pain shooting through my leg. I turned around and saw the hanged man grasping my ankle, pulling his body up to meet me. I shook with the darkest, deadliest torment as he stared into my face. My world became a blur, and any resistance drained from my body as his eyes consumed my soul. My mouth dropped open in a silent scream as red filled my head, and every one of my fears again rose to the surface. Madness threatened to rip my mind in two. As darkness approached, my mind began to fade. Suddenly, through the agony, I heard another sound. A splashing, a muted rush of churning water. The hanged man turned to look towards the surface. I followed his gaze. Louvold and his people were in the water and frantically swimming towards the red cloud. The hanged man roared and looked back at me, then to the others. With a snarl, he released me. My mind shimmered and then refocused, the red leaving my fractured brain in a rush of heat. Still bound, I watched as the hanged man raced to stop the others from entering the red cloud. I watched as he tore them apart, filling the water with crimson viscera. The cloud engulfed me as I descended into the depths. A moment later, I lost consciousness, and everything turned black. I don't really remember what happened after I reached the cloud. I don't recall the in-between. There was just nothing. The next thing I remember was getting CPR on the beach from the father who had been building a sandcastle with his son, the good dad. I sputtered back to life, screaming and vomiting up a great deal of salt water. I laid weeping on the beach as an ambulance was called. I was rushed to the hospital and cared for, questioned, and given some much-needed rest. I've never recovered fully from my experience. I'm still not entirely sure what happened, where I went, or how I got there. For a long while, I didn't know if what I went through was even real, or if those people, those creatures, were real, or if I experienced some fearful hallucination between the reality of the living and the dead. As time passed, I tried to discard the horrors I went through as something my mind conjured to stay alive. I wanted to believe that the nightmare world I visited was nothing more than some horrific dream I used to stave off death. But I can't. No matter how much I'd like to deny the existence of that terrible place beneath the Riptide, I just can't. After I was rushed to the hospital, the father who resuscitated me came for a visit. That day, in a moment, he told me something that has haunted me ever since, and which erased all of my doubts.
Son, you're real lucky. It's the damnedest thing, though. When I found you, your hands were tied.
White Noise. Written by Anton Scheller. Narrated by HarshlyCritical. Static. White noise. They say it's good for you. Your brain can tune out all the distracting noises of the world and instead just focus on the one important thing of the moment. I always enjoyed static. The mindless noise that suffocates all others. Most people try to make the world of cars and people disappear behind a veil of music. But for me, white noise was always more efficient. Turn it on, and after the few moments that your mind takes to adjust, everything unimportant fades into the distance. Without the constant disturbances, your head feels light and clear, and your thoughts can flow freely. Music never did that for me. A few times, friends asked me whether it was damaging my hearing to listen to white noise all day. Of course, they were exaggerating. I only had my ears filled with static whenever I was alone, or wanted to be and feel alone. Static was my escape from the world. Still, their doubts were justified. My doctor said it was okay as long as I gave my brain a break every few hours. Without a break, the brain might adjust to the background noise. It might get addicted to the background noise. I followed his advice and made sure that I unplugged my headphones at least every few hours. They felt so much like part of my body that I sometimes forgot to pull the cables out of my ears, but usually I did. I think I never silenced the world with white noise for more than 4 or 5 hours at a time. At least, not until my seizure. I'm not actually sure whether it was a seizure. It could have been a miniature stroke or anything else that is strong enough to make an adult human unconscious. They never found what it was, but that's not important. What is important is that I was alone at the time. I was on the bed of my rented one-room apartment with a book in my hand and white noise in my ears. I saw my hands cramp. The book fell. Then everything went black. If not for my brother, I think I might have died. He wanted to visit. He rang the doorbell. He called my phone. Then, after half a day, he called the police. They found me on the bed. My body was lying sideways with my head pushed against the wall. I had a crust of saliva around my mouth and a crust of blood around my ears. My brother said that in the hospital, I woke up screaming. When the blackness faded away, it was replaced first by pain and then by noise. Pain and noise. That has been my life for the last 6 months. Even for my friends, it took a while until they understood that I'm not just rude. They still stare at the headphones when I meet them, but they have adjusted. They know that I can hear them through the noise, and they know that I can't hear them anymore without my headphones. With strangers, it is more difficult. Shopkeepers and waitresses always look as if they want to stab me for my rudeness. Making new friends has become hard. Most think that I am trying to make some odd fashion statement. I gave up on dating. But the social implications are not what bothers me. I never was the person that is upset about an evening alone at home. What bothers me are the noises I hear in the rare moments without white noise to drown them out. My doctor says that those 3 days without a break made my brain get used to the white noise. He says it is like an addiction. My brain is accustomed to hearing a constant level of buzzing background, and it reacts strongly when the background noise is taken away. Whenever I pull the headphones out of my ears, the first thing I feel is disorientation, as if I am suddenly falling off a cliff. Then the noises start to scream in my ears. Without the white noise, my brain seems to amplify all noises it registers. The doctor says that when I take the white noise away, my brain is trying to find a new level of background noise. He says we all have our natural threshold as to which noises we notice and which we don't. I destroyed that threshold. I don't mean to say that I can hear more than other people. My hearing has not magically improved by being damaged. But now, whenever the white noise is pulled from my ears, my brain does not know anymore what is background and what is not. My ears hear the same things as they always did, but now my brain consciously registers noises that before were swallowed by mental filters. What used to be background noise seems now, without white noise, as loud as a person speaking right into my ear. I hear a roaring sound, the fused sound waves of many sources, the natural white noise that we all have learned not to notice. But there are other noises too. They sound clunky and pale, like music amplified through cheap loudspeakers. But still, they are there, and they are real. I can hear car noises that I would have never noticed before. Despite the thick walls, I can hear my neighbor sweeping the floor, or watching TV, or having sex. I can hear cars 3 streets away. I hear my own heartbeat, and the blood pushing through my arms. I got used to those noises. Despite the screaming level, I would be able to live with them. What I can't live with are the voices. First I thought, they're just distant noises like all the others. But no matter where I go, no matter how deep I am in a forest or underwater, or how many layers of noise blockers are meant to keep them out, I can always hear them. Sometimes more, sometimes less. They vary with the environment. They are not just in my head. As said, they are clunky. Sometimes it's hard to even tell whether they are male or female. Still, I can recognize what they say. They speak about things to do. They discuss what should happen next.
The cup should fall. His knee should hit the table. Her spine should ache.
They don't always talk about me, although they do that too. I never noticed how many seemingly random events surround me. How the water drips, or the cup shakes slightly when it is placed back on the table. How the paper falls into the bin or flies past. There are at least 2 of these voices around everybody. There are at least 5 or 6 around every newborn. I think the newborns are not yet fully adjusted to the background noise. Sometimes, when the voices argue too loudly, the newborns wake up. They scream. With 2 or 3 years, children seem to have adjusted. They all don't notice anymore, even when the voices hiss and curse. I always thought it was good and bad luck. The open shoelaces and ripping grocery bags, the random wind that destroys the hairstyle, the tripping. But when I free my ears from the boundaries of the white noise, I now hear that luck is not random. The voices and their owners decide minutes ahead of time who will trip and who will miss the bus and who will not notice the approaching cars. Some of the voices seemed to like the people they are attached to. I saw a boy, he was maybe 4 or 5, that walked without attention and still kept his ice cream in one hand and his feet straight on the floor. Minutes before she got out of her chair, I knew the voices would keep a woman's stroller from rolling down the slanted street even as she forgot to apply the brakes. But I also heard the other side. 2 or 3 voices hissing and laughing from their throats while they planned the next mishap. There was a man in a ripped suit. He ran only by me for a moment, but the voices had been there long before. I had heard them discuss that he would trip and fall and break his arm. And I heard another group of voices, 7 or 8, nearly in hysterics. They were ahead of a little girl of maybe 6 or 7 years. Her dress got stuck on a tree branch. Her paper money was blown from her hand. But I didn't worry about her because of the dress or the money. I heard them discuss in which way best to kill her. Whether to drown her or to hurl her in front of a car. While they discussed, the girl tipped her head to the side and waved at me. I must have stared at her. I waved back and she, shyly, ran after her mother. The voices followed her.
"A fire,"
said one of the voices.
"I like to hear her scream." "A good idea,"
said another.
"We just need to make sure her mother will see."
The rest I didn't hear. At the beginning, when I still thought they were just in my head, the voices that follow me were gentle most of the time. But they get more angry whenever I talk about them, whenever I mention them. I can hear them scream, right now. I can hear them argue that it can't be that I know. I know that they want to break my chair to punish me. Still, I can only hear. I can't see them. I can't touch them. And whatever they want to do, I can't stop them.
I'm at Your Bedroom Window. Written by Maya Ellert and narrated by Alicia Pavlis. A warning for my fellow travelers. If you ever have a layover in Philly, overnight, don't spend the night at the Economy Motel. And if you absolutely must, just steer clear of room 103. I was heading south to visit family. Unfortunately, the only flight available included a 7-hour layover in Philadelphia. Not wanting to spend those hours huddled outside the airport, I rented the cheapest motel I could find and took the shuttle at about 11 p.m. The place was just about the shadiest looking motel I had ever seen. But it was a bed, right? I checked in, headed to my room. 103. Exhausted, I immediately collapsed on the bed. A bit lumpy, but not terrible. Not bothering to take my contacts out, I closed my eyes and let my thoughts wander. But I was yanked back to reality by a loud grumbling from my stomach. Right, the airline hadn't fed us. Annoyed, I dug around in my bag for one of those microwavable soup cups. I tossed it into the microwave, and as it rattled away, I noticed there was a piece of paper wedged underneath it. I yanked it out and unfolded it. There were 2 words hastily scribbled on it. Don't look. Whatever. I tossed it aside and retrieved my soup. Feeling lonely, I decided to hop online to see if anyone was on. I was in luck. My long-distance boyfriend just happened to be on Skype. So I called him up. We talked for a while, trying to keep our voices down. Eventually, though, he said something that made me laugh, and I heard a muffled curse come from upstairs. Feeling guilty, I said my goodnights and ended the call. But as I lay in the dark room, I noticed a thin stream of light from where the curtain didn't close completely. Annoyed, I got up to close it, and I was almost at the window when I heard it.
I can see into your bedroom.
The voice sent a chill up my spine. It was very quiet and high-pitched like a child's. And it was so soft, I wasn't even sure I hadn't just imagined it. I shook my head and reached for the curtain.
I know you can hear me. I'm at your bedroom window and I know you can hear me.
I jumped back as a shadow crossed the stream of light coming into my room. I definitely hadn't imagined it that time. There was a voice directly outside my door. Someone was out there, looking in. I jumped back into bed and pulled the covers right up to my chin.
I'm at your bedroom window. I know you can hear me. I can see in your bedroom. Are you listening to me? I know you can hear me. Come and take a look. I'm at your bedroom window.
The taunting went on and on, rattling into my thoughts and leaving me paralyzed in fear. Suddenly, I heard the tenant upstairs moving around again. Footsteps stomped over to the door above, and I heard muffled shouts saying,
"Hey, shut up down there. This isn't funny. I have work in 4 hours."
I breathed a sigh of relief and leaned back against the pillow, determined to get some sleep.
I'm still out here. Come look out your window.
I sat straight up, heart pounding in my ears. The voice was back. It whispered on, repeating its mantra over and over again. I put my hands over my ears and rocked back and forth, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The longer I sat there, the louder it got, until I couldn't hear anything else. It sounded like it was right next to me.
Are you listening to me?
Frantic, I picked up the phone and dialed the police. Stammering and stuttering in fright, I managed to give them the information of where I was and what was wrong. I asked them to please help. I was so scared. I didn't care if it was a prank at this point. My mind was reeling in terror. The officers assured me they'd be over shortly to see what the issue was. I thanked them and hung up the phone. But as soon as I did, silence descended over the room. It wasn't just that the voice had stopped. No, utter silence filled the room. The air conditioner stopped. The street noises outside ceased. Even the faint hum of electricity from the TV and lights went away. It pressed on my ears with a tangible heaviness that sent shivers through me. Next to me, the phone rang. The caller ID told me it was the police station, calling me back. Cautiously, I picked it up and answered. "Hello?" I whispered. Growled the voice, and every light went out, plunging the entire room into complete and total darkness. In the dark, I fumbled for my bag. I might not have had a flashlight, but I did have my video camera, which had a weak light on it. Besides, I can't deny I wanted to film this. if only to prove I wasn't going insane. Finding it, I turned it on, casting a dim light over the room. Even with this light, the shadows still consumed the edges of my vision, making me jump at every perceived motion caught in the corner of my eye. Shaking, I forced myself to focus on the camera. Carefully, I stood up from the bed and walked toward where I thought the curtain was. The thin light from the camera only served to give a vague outline of the curtain and door, as though the darkness had swallowed the room and was even now working against the light from my camera. Carefully, I reached out and touched the curtain, pushing it closed all the way. Whatever was out there couldn't look in now. But then, I heard a loud clicking sound next to me, like a latch turning in the door. Panicked, I whipped around to look at the door. Inexplicably, it had opened on its own. The latching sound I had heard, however, was the door getting caught by the extra security lock. I could see nothing through the crack, just more inky blackness outside. I slammed the door shut again, double-checking the locks and latches. Everything was in place. I breathed a sigh of relief, and that's when I heard it. A sort of scuttling sound coming from the back of my room, somewhere in the direction of the bathroom. Cautiously, I moved slowly toward the noise, trying to keep my hands from shaking too badly. I knew whatever footage I got was going to be a mess of wobbly camera, but my videographer skills weren't exactly my top priority at that moment. I approached the source of the noise, but found nothing there, except for another piece of paper wedged partly behind a wall-length mirror next to the closet. I fumbled to open the folded-up scrap, trying not to tear it in my haste. When I finally got it open, there were only 2 words. Turn around. I was not about to do anything of the sort. Trembling, I slowly looked up at the mirror, while pointing my camera behind me at the same time. And to my horror, the light from the camera illuminated a faint silhouette of something behind me. All I could make out was a vague form, no taller than the height of the bed, and it was moving toward me. I broke out of my paralysis and dove into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. Quietly sobbing, I leaned against the door and slowly slid down until I was sitting on the cracked tiles. The door firmly closed and locked behind me. Whatever it was scrabbled a bit at the bottom of the door. Then came the whisper.
Let me in. I'm out here in the dark.
Let me in.
Go away! I screamed. The voice stopped abruptly. I shivered and let out the breath I'd been holding in tightly. I still clung to my camera, unwilling to let go of the one thing that was keeping me tethered to reality. I sat there until the rays of early sunlight began peeking under the door, and I knew it was safe. Carefully, I cracked open the door and peeked around. The coast was clear. In a rush, I grabbed all of my luggage and raced out the door. The hotel manager looked at me kind of oddly, but I wasn't going back in that room. I spent the next hour in the lobby waiting for the shuttle. The flight to my aunt's house was short and uneventful. I spent the entire flight running over what had happened in my mind, over and over. Could it have been a prank? And who could have done that? It didn't matter. It was over. I was out of that insane place and on my way to meet family and friends. I tried to put the whole thing behind me and just enjoy the ride. You see, I've always loved flying. Watching the world fall away behind me is one of the most incredible feelings. The patterns beneath you, the rivers, ponds, winding roads spotted here and there with cottony clouds. This time, however, I just couldn't enjoy the scenery. I was too on edge from the previous night's events. The plane finally landed, and I just about ran to meet my aunt and cousins. Finally, I could start my vacation and get back to a normal state of mind. I hugged my aunt and little cousin so tight just to be sure they were real. We all laughed and packed up the car with my luggage to head home. I didn't tell them about the motel. That night, my aunt made my favorite, pan-seared salmon, dripping with lemon and butter. Since she lived so close to the beach, it was fresh from that day's catch, and I don't think I've ever had anything so sweet and fresh. Sitting here with my family, I could almost laugh off the events of the night before. Almost. Silence descended upon the house as night fell upon us, bringing with it a thick fog. The little cousins toddled off to bed, yawning and rubbing their eyes. My aunt and I sat quietly in the living room, her reading, and me silently recalling the night before, over and over. Finally, exhausted, I got up and announced that I was heading to bed early. A bit surprised, my aunt wished me good night, and I headed to my room to collapse. Once alone, however, I felt unease creeping around me. The only lamp in the room was the bright overhead, too bright to sleep with, and with the fog as thick as it was, no light came in from outside. As if that weren't unsettling enough, at the foot of my bed was a large window, and there was no curtain, only a Venetian blind. I shivered and turned on my side so I couldn't see the window, and slowly, I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke sometime around 3 a.m. to an odd squeaking noise, like nails running across glass or tile. Confused, I sat up and looked around. Blinking, my eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. Still, I could see nothing that could be making the noise. In fact, it seemed to be coming from somewhere outside. My heart rate quickened as I stood up and approached my bedroom window with apprehension. With shaking fingers, I reached for the pull to open the blinds. I yanked down with one swift tug and the blinds flew open. Nothing. In a rush, I let out the breath I'd been holding in. I had only imagined it. Or had I? As I glanced down, I noticed the long, slightly smudged mark near the bottom of the window, as though some grubby hand or paw had run along the glass, looking for a way in. I dropped the blinds and dashed back to bed and pulled the covers right up over my head, desperate for some sleep. It seemed impossible that I'd ever get back to sleep after that. But eventually, I drifted off, dreaming of strange noises and small, scuttling creatures hiding just at the edge of my vision. I woke up in the late morning, head wreathed in fog from a restless night. My phone was buzzing next to me. Squinting, I glanced at it to see that I had 5 unread messages, all from my aunt. I shook my head, not wanting to bother at this moment, and fell back against my lumpy pillow. Wait. Something was wrong. My eyes flew open and I sat up. No. Even without glasses or contacts, I could tell I wasn't in my room at my aunt's. But no, I couldn't be. I wasn't, no. I was. I was back in the motel room from the night before. I tried to scream, but only a choked cry escaped my lips. I looked back at my phone. Every message from my aunt was a variation on "Where are you?" I ran to the door, threw it open, and dashed to the office. In a panic, I ran in and immediately started begging the manager for help. He looked up, startled, but not at me. At the door I'd just come through. That door again, I thought I'd fix that damn thing, is what he said, without a single glance at me. He walked over and shoved the door closed, giving it an extra push with his shoulder. He hadn't even seen me. Later, I returned to room 103, numb and confused. As I sat on the bed, I heard the voice one last time.
You're mine.
It taunted, but I didn't care. I couldn't even muster up enough emotion anymore. I've lost count of the days I've spent here now. I don't think I'm dead, just not quite synced up with the rest of the world. These days, I'm the one leaving the notes, warning travelers not to look out their window. Most of them laugh when they see the scribblings, but I don't worry too much. It's the people that dwell too long on my message. They worry me. They're the ones that listen too closely to the voice in the window. They're the ones that might end up like me someday. There's a young couple staying here right now. I'm sitting outside, waiting for them to quiet down and go to sleep. I'm trying not to think of how life was before I ended up here. I mean, I've tried leaving, but I can't get past the parking lot entrance. The only knowledge I get from the outside world now is from my phone and the occasional news program I watch during what passes for a continental breakfast around here. I think the two inside have fallen asleep. Well, he has at least. I'm not worried about him. His girlfriend or fiancé or whatever. I'm concerned for her. She's still up, eyes darting around. I know she saw my note. She's definitely upset. She's a perfect target. Excuse me now. I'm gonna go and huddle in the closet with my hands over my ears, because the voice is going to start again soon.
Come look. I'm at your bedroom window.
The Thing That Stalks the Fields by David Feuling. Narrated by Otis, Jiry. It was a few weeks ago that the hay bales started creeping slowly away from the house. Every morning when I woke up, each had moved a few hundred feet from where it was before. I assumed it was pranksters with nothing better to do, so I ignored it. Within a few days, though, the bales began to approach the boundaries of the farm. I was tired of this whole game by then and decided to move them back. It took a tedious hour to bring them all from where they were to over near the house again, and by the time I was done, I was ready to snap the neck of whatever little pissant was deciding to screw with me. The next morning, I found each and every one of my horses messily decapitated. The smell was what woke me up. Each one was slumped over against the side of its stall. There were no signs of the heads. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess and burying the remains. It was only when I was done that I noticed the bales of hay had all returned to their positions from the day before, scattered far out into the fields. This time, I left them where they were. That night, I sat on my porch with my shotgun in hand and a pot of coffee on the table beside me. I sat for hours, straining my eyes, watching the fields to catch a glimpse of who was moving my hay bales. Finally, I was beginning to nod off. I would have, but just as my eyes began to close, I heard a clamor and a rustling of trees from the nearby woods. I leaned forward, my heart racing with excitement. I was going to catch the bastard. I fumbled with my gun and fidgeted in my seat, waiting anxiously for whoever it was to get close enough to ambush. It was only when the thing got close enough for me to make out its silhouette in the dark that I was frozen still. The thing that crept into my fields from the nearby woods didn't seem to notice me sitting there. It stalked, hunched and deliberate through the field with the posture of a tiptoeing thief. If not for the fact that it must have towered over 10 feet tall, even in its crouched position, it might have seemed almost frail. The thinness of its arms and legs and the emaciated, caved-in quality of its chest reminded me of a starving animal. Still, this thing was undeniably strong, and I watched it hoist each bale up into its arms with ease and set it down carefully a while away, taking only a few strides to cover the distance. I watched it work, moving each bale thoughtfully. Every once in a while, it would straighten up to look around at the other bales' positions in the field before adjusting the one it was working on ever so slightly. Before it left, it looked towards the house. I felt its eyes sweep over me in the dark, but whether it saw me or not, I couldn't tell. And then it turned silently and crept back the way it came, disappearing into the dark of the woods. It took me an hour before I had the courage to move at all. I went inside after a while, but didn't sleep that night. It was only when the sun arose that I dared step off my porch into the fields. The hay bales were where it left them. Strangely, it didn't move them as far as it had in the previous days. They were approaching something invisible in the fields, and as I looked at them, I realized that they seemed to be marking some line. Indeed, as I walked around the house, I saw the distinct circle that they formed with me at the center. At first, I thought the bales were just being haphazardly moved away from the house, but now I could see that they were instead being moved toward some boundary. The thing was sending me a message. I slept uneasily that night, and only because I was exhausted. They didn't move at all for the rest of the week, in fact. They were finally where the thing wanted them. I made myself sick trying to interpret them. Why would this thing expend so much energy moving my hay bales and threatening me with such violence should I try to interfere? Killing my horses was just that, a threat, an intelligent threat at that. It knew what would scare me, and it knew that I would understand the implications. The sound of an automobile working its way along the road to my farm one morning gave me a little rush of excitement. I'd been planning to abandon the farm since I saw the thing, but I couldn't hope to leave on foot without risking it treating me like it had treated my horses. But if I could get in the car with whoever was coming my way, I might be able to escape before it could stop me. I don't know or care who it was. I decided that moment they stopped the car, I would jump in the passenger seat and tell them to get the hell out of there. I didn't get the chance. The car worked its way slowly along the road, trundling across the uneven ground. I urged it silently to hurry. It was when it passed between the two bales placed on either side of the road that I began to hear a booming clatter from the woods. The thing burst suddenly between the trees, sprinting on all four of its terrible, gangly limbs toward the car. Within a few seconds it was there, pouncing on the automobile like a predatory cat. Within moments, it was picking and peeling the vehicle's steel frame apart, working to get at the driver. The man, whoever he was, screamed all the while, and I could hear him even over the crunching of metal and the shattering of glass. It was only when the thing crushed him carelessly in its hand that the screaming stopped. It tossed him away and straightened up to look at me once again. In the sunlight, I could see the inhumanity of it.
It was composed entirely of something awful and alive which was lashed together in a messy semblance of a human form. Whatever it was made of looked so polished and hard that if it weren't for the minute writhing of the stuff, I'd think it was made of granite. The thing retreated back into the woods, and I was left to my shock. My eyes wandered to where the car sat, the engine still sputtering between the two of the hay bales. Suddenly, I understood. The message was clear. I am this thing's captive, and I am not allowed visitors. Nothing may cross the borders it has set. I'm trapped here by the thing that stalks the fields, and it demands nothing except that I never leave. Still, I don't know if I can handle being that thing's canary. I've been thinking hard for the last few days since I saw it crush that man's chest, silencing him before he could finish his scream. If I crossed the hay bale border, it'd probably do the same. It'd smash my skull before I could put my hands up to protect myself. It'd go and find a new pet and probably keep looking until it found someone who could stand knowing that it was just waiting outside, watching it at all hours with its shiny insect eyes. I've been thinking hard for the last few days, and I might just make a run for it.
Lions and Tigers and Bears. Written by Andrew Harmon. Performed by Jason Hill. The night started so smoothly. It was Tamale Tuesday and Hector's week to bring the chow. Hector's shift started an hour earlier than mine, so I didn't see him when I passed Steve at the time clock just inside the security shack. Steve punched out and tossed me his keys, not bothering to update me on anything. It's a zoo. We're here after hours. What could he update me on anyway? Maybe the hyenas were looking suspicious. When didn't they? I grabbed walkie-talkie number 8 from the cabinet and checked the batteries. The static hissed when I tapped the talk button. The beam of my mag light swept across the open doorway of the security shack. You, out there, Hector? I spoke into walkie-talkie number 8.
Hey, roger that,
Hector said. Hector was Guatemalan, so the in that took on more of a duh sound under the influence of his accent. You got the goods? I asked.
Break room fridge. Pollo and green chilies tonight, Holmes.
You the man, Hector. I grinned. What's your 1020?
Lizard hut.
All right, I'm gonna go walk grasslands. The staff entrance was on the north side of the park, same side as general admission, only about 200 yards further west. When I left the small square office, I almost immediately plunged into the winding paths of the aquatic center. The prominent sound rising above the chirp of crickets and the lilt of the wind rustling through the pathside gardens was the waterfall on the polar bear exhibit. A rush of blue water raced off the high faux cliff above the enclosure and crashed into the 30-foot depths of the polar bear's pool. The polar bears were among the few animals allowed to sleep outside. After hours, when we guards worked, a majority of the animals were bedded down in the sleeping compartments at the rear of the enclosures. As I passed by the pen, I could hear Sasha, the largest of the 3 polar bears, snuffling and grumbling in her sleep. I paused to lean against the railing of the enclosure. Jax and Rory, the younger bears, sat on their hinds, flanking the sleeping Sasha, and stared off into the night. Their heads turned, slowly, small ears flicking around at the slightest noise. Now, I'm not an animal keeper, but I can tell when something's spooked. These two look pretty spooked. Probably just saw a raccoon scavenging around in the trash cans. If there's one thing I know about ferocious predators, is that once they've grown accustomed to captivity, well, they kind of become wimps. Big wimps. I walked past the empty stonescape at the penguin exhibit, past the calm pool where the sea lions spent their afternoons rolling around on their bellies and clapping their fins for the children, hoping for just one more trick and one more fish from the trainer's hands. Past that was the large dome of the aquatic center where zoo patrons descended into the underground tunnels to view penguins and walruses and polar bears diving down into the deep water. I knew that Steve always does a walkthrough of the dome before ending his shift, so I don't bother patrolling the interior too often on my shift. The doors were locked after hours anyway, so no one could sneak in. I came out of the aquatics area onto the main walkway, which zipped up the center of the zoo and split into two paths at the concessions area. Here, all the large umbrellas were folded down and stuck up like pikes out of the centers of round white tables. I took the path to the left of the Dippin' Dots stand towards the grasslands. This path was lined with skinny poplar trees that blinded visitors in the maintenance roads that wound along the border of the grasslands. Now and then, a break in the trees would give me glimpses of the largest exhibits in the zoo. Here, zebras and gazelles roamed freely with cassowaries and bristling porcupines. Since this area was so large and inhabited by multiple species, these animals were allowed to sleep outside as well. I froze in my tracks when I spotted something between the scraggly branches of the two browning poplar trees. In one corner of the exhibit, a shadow bolted across the grass. A cassowary let out a shrill shriek nearby, followed by a peculiar clicking sound. I pushed between the two trees but could go no further than the chain fence that separated the visitor's path from the service road. I had just enough of a view to see two black lumps slumped over near the adjacent edge of the enclosure. One of the shadows lifted its head in my direction, and a pair of burning red eyes reflected back at me. I reached for the maglite at my belt, but by the time I had lifted the beam to illuminate the enclosure, the red-eyed creature had scurried out of sight. Still, the cassowary that had screamed and clicked was sitting in the grass with its legs folded beneath it. At first, I thought it was dead. After a few moments passed, the bird lifted its blue head and stared back at me. It was seemingly unfazed. I turned off my flashlight. Cassowary stared at me from the dark field, its eyes shining the same blood red as the creature I hadn't gotten a look at. The piercing crimson gaze made me shiver. I paged Hector on the walkies. These animals have crazy eyes tonight, or is it just me?
Hey, they're animals, gringo.
Hector answered.
They all got the crazy eyes.
I don't know, man. I watched the cassowary stand up as I held down the talk button. It stood tall, didn't move. I guess I'm just creeping myself out.
Homie, I just smoked a spliff behind the monkey house.
Hector wheezed.
Everything's creeping me out right now.
Jesus, you couldn't bother to call me? I said.
Sorry, amigo. Only enough for one.
I sighed and continued down the path through the grasslands. The slight cloud cover that had been blurring out the full moon receded, and the dark of the park became bright enough for me to see into the enclosures without my flashlight. Like I said, most of them were empty, so my view was mostly of flat, grassy fields, rocks, ferns, and the occasional city squirrel dashing from garden to garden. There was only one other exhibit in the grasslands that let the animals roam freely at night. The hyenas. I hated the hyenas. They cackled and colluded as I approached the railing outside of their cage. I watched the group of nocturnal miscreants skulking around in the shadows of their enclosure, shoulders slumped, heads held low, sniffing the soil and yipping at one another. I leaned against the fence and counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hyenas. 6. Hector, I buzzed on walkie number 8. Did they get a new hyena?
Hey, hell if I know. Those things freak me out.
I didn't usually make a point of counting the animals, but overnight security isn't exactly the most exciting career, so you find yourself doing the most mundane things to pass the time. And I was sure that even last night, there had only been 5 hyenas. The largest of the 6 was at the back of the enclosure, farthest away from me. It slinked along like the others, though its shambling seemed unlike the rest. I couldn't put my finger on why. While the movements of the other 5 seemed smooth and organic, this larger one shook and trembled. Maybe it was sick. Well, that would explain why the other 5 would have nothing to do with it. While they charged one another and nipped at each other's hind legs, this one seemed to be kept at arm's length from the rest of the pack. I raised my flashlight and shined it at the hunchback mutts. One at a time, their heads perked up, turned towards the source of the light beam. Their eyes, evolved for night vision, shined green in the light. Except for the large one. The large one in the back paid no attention to me. But as its head swept back and forth with each step, its eyes would flash red.
Damn!
Hector yelped over the walkie. My body stiffened. I nearly dropped my maglite. What's going on, Hector? Talk to me!
I stepped in horse crap back at the damn stable. Man.
I slid my flashlight back into its holster on my belt and turned from the hyenas. Clearly, there was nothing going on in the grasslands. There was nothing going on anywhere in this park. There never had been, and there probably never would be. Steve once caught a couple of teenagers trying to scale the wall into the elephant exhibit, but, well, that was about as criminal as the zoo gets. As I walked out of the grasslands, I looked back out onto the large expanse of green where the zebras and gazelles were kept. In the corner stood the cassowary, the same spot as when I had first come by. Its red eyes followed me as I passed. It skeeved me out. Maybe I'm wrong to go Captain Ahab on a bird, but I wanted to punch it right in its stupid beak. Where the grasslands returned to the head of the main path, I found one of the pretzel carts in the concessions hub had been knocked over. Coarse salt and pepper baskets were strewn across the pavement. A stack of napkins was scattering in the wind and were littered all around the picnic tables. Hey, Hector, you stoner, I called to him. You trying to steal pretzels?
Oh, no way, man. I'm miles away, too dry for pretzels. Man.
He joked. Well, you made a damn mess over here at concessions, I said.
I ain't been over the concessions. Man.
He replied. You expect me to believe the wind knocked this cart over? I asked.
Oh, man, you're security. Security ought to figure it out.
Hector, you're security too.
Yeah, well, right now I'm security over by the farm animals. You're security over by concessions.
I huffed, righted the cart, and made sure that the folding-up umbrella was held straight in its brace. There was a storage closet between the restrooms, and I went to grab a broom. The salt and the baskets I could handle, but walking around to pick up all those napkins was going to be a headache. Nonetheless, I did it. What else was there to do? It was a solid 20 minutes before I was even close to done when a roar shook the park. It was coming from the jungle section. I dropped the broom immediately and jogged off in the direction of the sound. Through my heavy breath, I managed to call out to Hector on the walkie. You hear that?
Yeah, you going to check it out, Gringo?
On my way, I answered.
I'll meet you there.
I followed the sound to its source in the tiger's cage. The yellow cone of my maglite combed through every corner of the enclosure, but it was empty. Nonetheless, fierce snarling and the sound of gnashing teeth split the silence of the jungle district. Hector came walking briskly up the path a few minutes later, but I had nothing to tell him. I just shrugged, gestured toward the tiger's pen. Hey, they screwing in there or something? Hector asked. Sounds rough, I said. Hector climbed up onto the middle rung of the fence and leaned against the iron bars of the cage, reaching his flashlight into the cage. This was something we were told to never do, but I didn't stop him. His own flashlight beam joined mine in the search and eventually came to rest on the black hole at the back of the den. This is the small area in which the animals bedded down at night, but it should have been locked. Instead, the door had swung open, and feral bedlam was emanating from inside. Should we, close it? Hector said from atop the railing. I ain't going in there, I said. I turned off my flashlight and grabbed my scratch pad to make a note. I would let the morning folks know about the unsecured tiger den, but there wasn't anything I could do about it tonight. I was in the middle of scribbling the word tiger when a familiar sound ticked in my ear. Clicking, like an insect's mandibles patiently clapping over a meal. Hector started to climb down back to the path and was about to say something when the ferns in the tiger's den clamored. Both of our heads swiveled around in time to see an inky blur race across the enclosure towards us, its black body permeating the iron bars like murky water through a grate, and dart just over Hector's head. Hector cursed. My head snapped around to follow the shadow as it disappeared into the cinnamon trees across the path. Their scraggly heads flailed, and the trunk shook, sending down a slurry of flaky tree bark, and filled the air with the scent of spice. "What the hell was that?" Hector cried. He was rubbing the side of his head, as if he had been slugged. No clue, man," I said. "Let's get out of here." We didn't leave immediately, though. We were frozen in place, watching the stillness of the cinnamon trees until we were certain we were alone. We stuck together for the remainder of the night, patrolling only near the entrance of the zoo and sinking most of our time into recounting the tale to one another in the guard shack. We hadn't even touched the tamales Hector's wife had sent with him. Just before dawn, an hour after Hector went home, I was standing by the time clock with my punch card. I peered out from the guard shack and into the aquatic center. Sasha and Jax were nowhere to be seen in the polar bear pool. But Rory sat right where I had seen her at the beginning of the shift, resting on her haunches in the middle of the island rock, staring at the sky. I squinted to get a better look. Rory's head turned slowly to meet my gaze, and her eyes were piercing red. The following night, Steve tossed me his keys and pointed to a memo hanging on the wall of the guard shack. I nodded and grabbed walkie-talkie number 8 from the rack, checking the batteries before I strapped it to my belt. It was a few minutes before 10 o'clock, but Steve punched out and took off without a word. He seemed tense. I stood in front of the memo by the door and expected the worst. It read, "Attention all employees. Several of the animals have been acting strangely today, and we ask for your assistance in making them as comfortable and stress-free as possible. A number of the animals in the grasslands, jungle, and aquatic sections have refused food and any interaction. Some factors that could create these issues include stress, sickness, and abuse. We ask all employees, regardless of job title, to keep an eye out for any agitators that could be inducing or exacerbating these episodes. Please report any strange findings to park management and escort belligerent guests out of the park if you witness any abuse of the animals. Night staff, please refrain from use of flashlights around the nocturnal animals and keep cell phone ringers silenced. We appreciate your understanding in this matter and thank you for your cooperation. Management." Hector and I knew that something strange was going on, but what exactly could we report? "Yes, Mr. Manager, we believe that a red-eyed shadow monster is attacking the animals." "Oh no, it doesn't unlock the cages. It can move through the bars." "Yes, of course. I'm sane, sir." I set my flashlight down on the desk. I wouldn't be able to use it anyway. Leaning back, I peered out the narrow doorway at aquatics. There sat Rory in the center of the rock island, parked on her rear with her head turned towards me. Her glowing red eyes blinked twice, then turned back towards the blank sky. Hector?" I said into the walkie-talkie.
"Hey there, gringo,"
he replied, his voice sullen. "How's it, going?" I asked. Half a minute must have passed before he responded.
"Not good. These animals are all acting weird. Like you said, even the lizards, they have red eyes."
"You at the lizard hut?"
"Yes."
I grabbed a pen off the desk and my notepad. If these animals were one by one being turned into red-eyed monsters, I was going to at least make a note of it. I started in aquatics, sauntering slowly around the meandering pathways. Item 1 on the list. Polar bears, ×3. Affected, ×1. I stopped by their pool and leaned over the railing to make out the figures in the dark. Though Rory sat center stage in the island, Sasha and Jax were huddled on the opposite rock ledge, avoiding her. None of the three made a peep. All I heard was the waterfall rushing off the rocks and churning up the otherwise smooth surface of the pool. The rest of the above-ground pens were empty this time of night, but to be sure my count was accurate, I would have to go into the dome. The keys jingled on my hip with every step I took towards the iron double doors to the dome. It had been a while since I had went inside, so it took me a few tries to find the correct key. Once I entered, I descended the wide flight of stairs into the underground tunnel, all of it completely dark, apart from a few maintenance lights in the corners of the rooms. The first room I entered in the dome was a large, round area, the center of which held a 20-foot-long shallow pool. Small sharks, maybe 1.5 feet at their largest, circled and weaved under the water. The dark blue walls of the dome were covered in paintings of sharks, showing their comparative sizes to varying species and also to the average human. The average human painting stood in front of the shark size chart, waving nonchalantly, despite the stack of 8 shark species lined up beside him. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary here, so I continued into a tunnel towards the next room. This area was slightly smaller, and its walls were lined in tanks. Octopi, jellyfish, eels, anglerfish, you name it. It was hovering around in its own personal aquarium where columns of little bubbles danced up from the rocky floor towards the water's surface far above. 3 glass pillars stood in the center of the room, illuminated from the floor and the ceiling by purple and blue LEDs. In these pillars waved stalks of seaweed and tiny seahorses congregated amongst their leaves. I stood in the center of the 3 pillars and studied the miniature seahorses carefully. I reached a single finger up to the glass, as if to tap on the rim of their world, when a loud crash in the next room made me stiffen and suck in a sharp breath. I darted down the next tunnel and plunged into complete darkness of the next room. For some reason, the dim yellow maintenance bulbs had burnt out, and all I could hear in the opaque black was the sound of aquarium filters gurgling in the walls. An eerie chill crept up my spine. My fingers were trembling. I felt a presence in the room. Now, of course, there were undoubtedly many presences in the room, being that I stood in a zoo full of living creatures, but this was different, this was distinct. This was a chilling presence, and I felt his eyes on me. I turned round and round frantically, searching for the gaze that I knew would confront me. I grabbed my walkie and pushed the talk button, but the static on the speaker cut in and out. The weak signal was not enough to penetrate to the surface from the depths of the dome. My breathing was ragged. Why didn't I bring Hector along? I was resolved to retreat to the previous room, to recuperate the light until I either gathered the courage to continue or cower back up the stairs. But as I turned, I was greeted by red eyes floating in the dark, a short 6 feet from my left side. They burned bright. They were unwavering. They stared through me, meeting my gaze and into the back of my skull, my spine calcifying into a stiff rod, and my neurons firing off alternating sparks of adrenaline. Fight, flee, fight, flee, fight, flee, move, do something. But I was frozen, staring into those red eyes. They drifted closer. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played in the key of crappy MIDI player from my pocket. My cell phone buzzed and growled. I had forgotten to silence the ringer. As the harsh, tinny tones shattered the silence of the room, it was met with a raspy hiss. The red eyes reeled back. I took off in a flash down the next hallway, feet slapping on the carpet towards the light of the next maintenance lamp. The hissing settled behind me, but I did not feel I was being pursued. I plunged into the next tunnel and took out my phone to answer. It was Hector. When he didn't get a response from me on the walkie-talkie, he started to freak out and called my cell instead. Oh, thank God he did.
You gotta get over to the aviary, Meg,
Hector said. He sounded desperate.
Meet me here.
I told him I would and sprinted through the rest of the tunnels. Terror unfolded with each step. I passed by the large glass window in front of the macaroni penguins. The whole dozen of them were standing motionless on the rocks, their eyes a piercing red and their heads turned towards the ceiling. In the next room I could see the pair of walruses floating bumpy at the surface, their heads protruding from the water and tilted to the sky. I burst out of the exit of the dome, gasping for fresh air, and stared at the moon for the comfort of what light it could give. The darkness was cloistering. The silence of the zoo truly petrified me for the first time in my years working security.
Hey, you coming, man?
Hector said. I heard a shrill commotion in the background. I'm on my way, I said, and unlocked myself from fear. The aviary was near the lizard hut, just down the path from aquatics. Before I continued, I grabbed my notebook and jotted down, penguins times all affected, walruses times all affected. I was jogging through the zoo by this point. To the right of the path was a short hill upon which sat 3 tortoises, all renowned for being over 80 years old. Older, in fact, than the zoo itself. All 3 of them stood motionless on their stubby legs, their heads raised feebly towards the sky, their eyes shining that same haunting red. As I neared the aviary, I could already hear why Hector had called me over. The birds were flipping out. The squawking and screeching and shrieking rose to such a shrill cacophony that I almost had to cover my ears to stop them from ringing. Hector waved his arms in a broad arch from the front of the mesh coliseum. Behind him, leafless trees reached up in a tangled crosshatch of branches. Ropes hung down from the branches, dangling down bird feeders stuffed with seeds and dried fruits. There was a smell of death that faintly irradiated from inside the aviary. This was the odor of dead rodents, which had been torn to shreds and picked clean of meat by the hawks and falcons that shared the same enclosure. Look, Hector pointed up towards the 50-foot curved ceiling of the wire dome. A circus of birds were wheeling around and flailing against the ceiling. They were dashing themselves against the wire cage. I watched as a hornbill flapped its wings feverishly, swooped down in a tight arch, and veered back up towards the sky. It smashed into the wire mesh with a thud and stuck there, wings thrashing desperately in a ball of shed feathers. What are they doing, man? Hector asked, his voice cracking. He may have been crying, but it was too dark to tell. They're trying to kill themselves or something. I had a hunch. I backed up far enough that I could get a shallower angle looking at them, and sure enough, the panicked bird's eyes were alight with a fiery crimson. I sat down right there on the pavement and stared at my shoes. Hector threw his arms out to his sides, wondering what the hell I was doing. He said something, but the words were lost in the racket of the bird's cries. They're possessed, I muttered. What? Hector asked and came closer. They're frickin' possessed! I nearly shouted the words. By what? Hector asked. Oh, I don't know, man, I said. Whatever the hell was we saw last night, the thing that came out of the tiger's den. I pulled out my notepad and updated the count. Tortoises times 3, birds times several. I read the list to Hector. He added a few that he found. Crocodiles, all affected. Horses, all affected. Hyenas, all affected. And that was just the animals that were left outside at night. Who knew how long the list would grow if we ventured into the dens where the animals slept after hours? Hector helped me back to my feet and we agreed to return to the guard shack. To cower in the safety of our offices until dawn, no longer bothering to count animals, to investigate the red-eyed shadows that plagued the zoo. Once we returned to the guard shack, though, an idea sprung up. I swung open the equipment closet beside the walkie-talkie pack and pulled down an old trail cam from the top shelf. There's nothing fancy, just an old motion sensor camera with night vision that we had used a few years back to capture a particularly cunning escaped python. What are we going to do with that? Hector asked. Find out what the heck we saw last night, I said. What has been possessing all these animals and causing them to go crazy with creepy eyes? We agreed that we would need bait. We would need an animal that had not already been affected by, well, whatever it was that had been running amok around the park. By this point, we couldn't name any that were left outside at night that hadn't already been attacked. Hector scratched his head. He suggested we take one of the inside sleeping animals out, but what animal would be tame enough for 2 night security guards to lead out into the open? Half an hour later, we had the trail cam set up in the southwestern corner of the zoo. The farm animals. In the center of an intersection where 2 of the pathways met, Hector stood with a 10-foot length of rope, the other end of which was looped around the neck of Catherine, the spotted cow.
Oh, screw this, man. Why do I gotta be the bait?
Hector said into the walkie. I was sitting in the office watching the trail cam through the computer monitor. I answered, "You're not the bait, Catherine is. This thing is going after animals, not us."
You sure about that, man?
Hector asked, his voice sullen. "Shh," I said. The trail cam had a small microphone, and I heard a strange sound approaching. On the monitor, Hector turned this way and that way, desperately trying to find out where the noise was coming from. It was the slow clip-clop of hooves on the cement. With every few steps, a dull bell would sound.
What the hell is that?
Hector whined into the walkie. It sounds like... I strained my eyes trying to see something in the grainy night vision. A cow. Behind Hector, a bulky shadow emerged from the darkness in the path. Hector was still twisting all around in search of the noise, but I could see it clearly in the splotchy green night vision. It was, in fact, a cow. "It's a cow, Hector," I said.
What?
He asked. That was the last question I heard him mutter before the bovine shadow behind him erupted. Its bulky round body burst into a flurry of flailing tendrils. They slithered across the ground, the tip of them raised like the poised heads of cobras. From the center of the miasma, a pair of eyes flared bright. I heard Hector scream. The cow wailed. The black swarm engulfed them both, tendrils of shadows whipping the air. Hector cried out for help. Catherine's hooves stomped feverishly against the concrete. Then, click, 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 click. The clicking started. The amorphous mass of black shivered and pulsed. I grabbed my flashlight and flew off into a sprint from the office. The night air whizzed by my ears, deafening me to the sound of chirping crickets. The crash of the waterfall diving down into the polar bear pool. The sound of my own boots clapping on the ground. I wound my way up through the aquatics, up the main path, split off to the right of the dip and dot stand, and burst through the wrought iron archway at the entrance of the farm animals. In the center of the intersection, where we set up the camera, Hector and Catherine were standing, untouched by the shadows I'd seen on the monitor. "Hector?" I called out. I got no response. You okay, Heck?" I asked. Silence. I circled around the edges of the pavement, keeping my distance. As I rounded in front of Hector, my heart stopped. He and Catherine stood motionless together. Their heads were tilted back. Flaming red radiated in their eyes. "Oh, no. Oh, Hector, no," I moaned. This could go on no longer. I grabbed my cell phone and proceeded to dial 911. I had no idea what was wrong with Hector, but maybe a hospital could do something for him. Maybe it was just some new illness that jumped species. Maybe it was a parasite. The phone rang and a voice answered, asking what my emergency was. But I could not answer. Because above me, the clouds had parted like the Red Sea. And from behind them shined such a brilliant light that I couldn't help but stare in awe at the pulsating glow. A ring of them spun and danced in the sky, red lights glimmering like sirens. I glanced over at Hector and Catherine. The red in their eyes was flashing. On, off, on, off, on, off. Their eyes blinked like Morse code as if they were communicating with the dancing lights in the sky. I looked around me at the park. Red glows were flashing in unison from everywhere inside the zoo. I backed away from Hector and the cow cautiously. What do I remember next? Not much. An explosion of light, the sound of objects whirring by at high speeds, a smell like when something gets caught in a vacuum and burns out the motor. Then, dawn. Waking up on the cold pavement, trying to explain to the GM where all his damn animals went, explaining to Hector's wife over the phone that he probably wouldn't be coming home. I remember the bewildered stares and awkward silence I was greeted with whenever I tried to explain what happened. But most of all, I remember that last moment before the flash when I glanced down at Hector, and his head turned to me, and his red glowing eyes blinked twice. And he smiled.
Chilling tales for dark nights.